All right. Well, hi, Jennifer. Thank you for being here with me today. I'm very excited to chat with you again about this particular topic because what you do is very interesting to me, and I think all of our tube fed friends will really enjoy learning from you. So, if you don't mind sharing a little bit about yourself and what your job is, and maybe a little bit of how you got into this, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So thanks for inviting me on the podcast. I know, I'm so thankful to be here and happy that you're interested in what I have to say in the blended tube feeding world. Um, so yeah, I'm a registered dietitian. I'm in Ontario, Canada. For those of you who don't know, or maybe like know a little bit, it's kind of I'm just about an hour outside of Toronto. Um, I've been a dietitian for 20 years now, which is kind of wild when I think about it, and kind of like what's brought me here. So I've been a dietitian in mostly hospitals, so the what we call it clinical nutrition, but I've also spent some time in home care as a dietitian. I've worked in long-term care. I've worked in grocery store consulting, so kind of like the gamut. But for most of my time as a dietitian, I mean, I've worked in the hospital for that whole time with mostly head and neck cancer, esophageal cancer, and kind of some upper GI motility things, so some gastroparesis, EOE, and things like that, and more from like the surgical side. But kind of, in my time at the hospital, kind of covered the gamut there. And then a few years ago, and we'll probably talk more about, I can kind of dive into more of like why specifically tube feeding and blended tube feeding, but more specifically in the last few years kind of started this, started with like social media and the blending dietitian, so really focused on helping people with um, introducing blended tube feeding into their tube feeding plans. So I don't know if you want more kind of like historically how I even became a dietitian and kind of like how it all culminated to this. Um, I was always kind of brought up to be mindful of food and its effect on our health. And, my mom was probably getting me to read labels long before like high school. I was probably like one of the youngest kids in my class that knew like, how many grams of XYZ and all my macros and stuff. But just to be mindful of
Hmm.
kind of like nutrition and health and how, what you eat affects your health. And then when I was kind of in my later high school years, my dad got diagnosed with cancer. And as a family, I mean, my parents kind of decided that they were going to go the approach of, dramatically changing our diet as a family. So we
Hmm.
became vegan. My mom tried like macrobiotics, and she studied extensively to make sure that our family was doing everything the right way. And it wasn't just a matter of like, we're just going to not eat meat, right? So,
Hmm.
really like doing that research and as a family, changing the way we ate. So that was kind of in my later years of high school when it was, looking at what to do as a profession, where I'd be going. And I kind of stumbled upon nutrition and becoming a dietitian. So I think like when I reflect back, like certainly those things all played a role in my kind of my past. And then when I kind of fast forward through like my undergrad and my master's, I did a placement at the hospital and just kind of like fell in love with clinical nutrition working in the hospital, which I never actually thought that was where I was going to end up. And then just kind of fell into a position there on the head and neck cancer and thoracic cancer surgery units, and kind of have been there ever since. And so, you can
Hmm.
imagine a lot of like head and neck esophageal cancer patients rely on tube feeding because of some of the,
Yeah.
the surgeries that they've had. And so my focus really has been with tube feeding in adults and just kind of helping people navigate that world, and then going home on tube feeds. Um, and then just kind of like morphed into, over the years, people would always ask me about putting food through their tube. And, it was never something we could do in the hospital setting, unfortunately.
Hmm.
It's kind of like always go home and the home care dietitian will kind of help you do that. It's kind of like the, the hospital world and the home care world. Um,
Yeah.
and then one of my patients' daughters actually kind of inspired me a few years ago. It was something that just kind of like clicked for me. Like of course, like kind of like referring back to my background, right? That like the impact that food can make on supporting, cancer for one, but just even chronic disease and, our overall wellness and health. And so I don't know, it was just something that clicked in me and her passion to provide for her mom. Her mom had just had like big like a tongue cancer surgery, so it meant that she was going to be going home on tube feeds, and she was going to spend, she wasn't going to be able to really eat much, so relying on tube feeds for her nutrition. It was really like important for
Wow.
her to provide a different means of nutrition than kind of the formula that we had started for her in the hospital. Um, so her kind of like, I'm going to give her food, I'm going to blend food for her, I'm going to put it through a feeding tube, and just kind of like more of the focus of getting her started and established because that's like the only thing that they were wanting to do. So
Hmm.
from the hospital, kind of realizing like, wait a minute, there's really not that much information out there for people that want to go that route. And certainly like I'm not throwing shade or whatever, like to other dietitians, but it's really not something that we're like taught about in school. I think that's
Hmm.
changing now.
Yeah.
And it was never something I was against. Um, but just kind of her passion and then the realization I think that there wasn't like a lot of support and information, just kind of got me into where I am now and supporting people more at home on tube feeds and introducing food. So
Yeah.
hopefully that wasn't
That's
like
amazing.
super
Like,
like long-winded answer,
no,
but
that was great. Everyone has a story that gets them to where they are. And I think like sometimes we feel like, oh, it's too much, it's too long, like you don't need to know the whole thing. But like that's really where I feel like people kind of connect, right? Because you don't you don't get it till you get it, right? And everybody's story of what they got might be a little bit different, but you can empathize more, you can understand a little bit more or see the path how somebody got to make that decision for themselves or how they got somewhere. And it's just really great because I've said so many times like I don't even remember what life was like before I knew what like macronutrients were and what micronutrients were or what calories were. I'm like, I miss the days when I could eat something and like not think about the calories or any of the content. And like I could just eat till I wanted to stop. I was full or I wasn't full and just wanted to keep eating. Like I don't even really remember what those days were. And for me, that's a blend of like diet culture, pre sick days of like when nutrition was starting to like be more widely talked about and people were accepting of it more, but there was a lot more of those extremes. Like I know you know all of this. And then going into being sick, it was like I had to watch calories and certain content of certain nutrients, your fat, your fiber, your protein, your carbs, and are you getting your micronutrients? If all you can tolerate are carbs, where are you getting these other things from? And I'm like, your brain just gets so overloaded, but the education around how to feed yourself, even as a completely healthy person, can be so restricted and so limited because people just don't think about it, or it's not like the first line of defense in chronic disease. It's not like, what are you eating? Well, what are your micronutrients? Are you taking your vitamins? Like it's happening more now, but I think about all of the conversations so many years ago. I'm like, why wasn't this brought up then? Like this could have made a difference. And then looking at that through a lens of being sick and with gastroparesis, I think I had mentioned this to you and we had talked before. Like, I wish somebody had said, "Are you interested in like real food blending or anything like that?" Because I would have loved to do that. Like hell, I would have been happy to blend up a pizza and put that in there if it sounded
yeah,
good. Like
yeah.
just to kind of feel a little bit more included. Like, sure, I'll have a piece of pizza, but I just need to eat it a certain way. Or maybe somebody has crazy allergies or intolerances to these formulas. And instead of being told, well, you've tried everything or we've done all we can do, like we don't know what to do with you, why isn't that the next step that's being offered? And again, it's probably happening more now, but it's just, I wish it was at more of the beginning of the conversation to say, does this interest you? Or would this be something that you would want to try if this doesn't work? And it's just weird to have that conversation after the fact, like, why didn't anybody talk to me about this? Why
Yeah.
wasn't this a conversation? But,
Yeah.
I did okay on my tube feed formula when I
Yeah.
had it, but
Of course, lots of
I
people
was
do,
very
right?
lucky. Yeah, it was a great formula. Like, Nestle was fantastic. I did very, very well, and some people do. And maybe having the convenience of the carton, or maybe it's powder and water, whatever you're using, the convenience for you is more important than having like the real food in your diet. And that's okay too. Like, whatever works for you,
Yeah.
that's what works.
Yeah.
But it would just be nice if this was more of an option up front to
Yeah.
think about.
I mean, I think like you touched on there, I think what's been so important is like talking about options and giving people, like empowering people then to know kind of all those options, because as somebody
Mhm.
has worked like I said, so many years in the hospital, and it not necessarily being an option in the hospital, but even to talk about kind of like we're starting you on this standard formula that we start people on in hospital, but just so you know that the option then when you go home, you could, start more food.
Yeah.
And your comment about opening a can, like there are lots of formulas now too that are, like when I say formula, I mean kind of like a pre-made um
Mhm.
something pre-made. So like we have like our standard synthetic ones that are, made of not food based. But there are lots
Mhm.
of companies coming out now too with like pre-made blended formulas. So they are kind of like more food based, and there could be like completely food based, or a mixture of like food and some sort of like, additional type of like, you know, supplemented with nutrients and stuff to kind of get
Mhm.
your get all your vitamins and minerals that way. So there are options for people too, right? That are convenience, but maybe shifting towards more of that food-based blending. So there's the
Yeah.
standard formulas that are more like synthetic. There's the pre-made blended formulas, and then there's kind of like making your own food, blended food, all from like homemade
Mhm.
ingredients, right?
Yeah, it's just I think about, like, around the holidays too, where I know so many people would, like, decorate, like, either their TPN bags or their formula bags to be like, "This is my turkey dinner," if it was, like, around Thanksgiving, or, like, draw candles on it for your birthday and
Yeah.
stuff, and it's like, it's the things you gotta do to feel like you're included, like, it's still part of what you're doing. You don't feel like you're not eating something, even though it's a little bit different. But I know that for me, a lot of what healed my relationship, like with food, when food and me were like 0% friends, where like I was not eating anything but like ice cream because that was all I could tolerate. And that was sometimes hit or miss. Right. And in that way of not hating food and not being so scared of food, I wanted to work with food. And I feel like if I could have done that for myself, like I fed everybody else around me, right? And it was great. And I have a good relationship with food now, mentally, physically. We're still at odds most of
Working
the
on it.
time,
Yeah.
but yeah, we're working. It's a work in progress.
Yeah.
But mentally, I'm okay being around food that I can't eat. I'm okay if I have to do something differently. I've talked about it plenty of times. Like I have no shame doing what I need to do, whatever that may be, to make sure that I am fed in the way that I need to be fed. And however that looks, like if it's different and you think it's weird, I really don't care. Right. But I'm like, it would have been really cool to feed myself when I was preparing food and doing that. Like, I wonder what that may have looked like. And for people, if I felt that way, if I felt like I wanted to cook, I know a lot of people who have gastroparesis that eat like near nothing or nothing at all, fantastic cooks, because we still want to be
Sure.
around food, whether that's just emotionally or culturally, like you want to be around food. And it just would have been interesting to think back of like, I prepare it this way for you and I prepare it this way for me, and just kind of having that. So I just love so much that there's more options now and more people talking about it. So if anybody listening is on formula and maybe they're doing really good, but they're like, this sounds interesting, how would you suggest somebody like bring up this conversation, whether it's with their GI or, their dietitian or both, to say, I'm interested in this? Like, where might you suggest they start? So if it was somebody that you're working with and they're like,
Yeah.
hey, I want to do this, like,
Yeah.
what would your first step be?
Yeah, so I mean, I know like sometimes it can be intimidating, right? Because it's not something that maybe they brought up, so it can be intimidating to bring something up maybe that, isn't presented to you. So, but I think maybe just like leading with like a curiosity type question, like, have you heard of blended tube feeding? Like, I'm thinking that that's something I might want to try. And so,
Mm-hmm.
you might find that they're open to talking about it, or, or even just for you to say kind of like why,
Mm-hmm.
because, um, maybe sometimes there's a stigma around like the thought or trying to kind of go, because people talk about it kind of more as like a natural thing, right? But it's not, it's really just kind
Yeah.
of like talking about the value and how that would impact your health and wellness kind of in general. So if it's something that's important to you for either, you just like you said, maybe you're tolerating it fine, but it's just something like you want to feel more included at mealtime, or if you're a parent and you want to prepare for your child on tube feeds, right? It's more of that like that connection piece. You want them to feel more included. You want,
Mm-hmm.
some more control or autonomy over how you're feeding yourself or your loved ones. That you want to be more like, in tune with ingredients and being able to choose those ingredients, right? And so like opening up that
Yeah.
conversation as to why it's important to you, or even to even, try. And it doesn't have to be always kind of like this all or nothing either, right? So it's
Mm-hmm.
not like I'm gonna do blended tube feeding and I'm gonna make all my food and we're gonna go from like 0 to 100 in
Mm-hmm.
like the next 3 days, right? Like it's a process, and maybe just talking to them about how you might want to start, how you might want to, why it's important to you, how you plan to go about doing that.
Yeah.
If they have hesitancy, sometimes asking them what's behind that hesitancy, because it could be something medical. So it could be, like you're working on different treatment modalities, and really right now is not a good time to try and switch things up. Like let's keep
Sure.
something steady right now. Let's keep your feeds just kind of going the way they are. Or, they have specific medical concerns, like they just don't think your GI tract can take, like whole foods at this moment,
Mm-hmm.
or if they have kind of like a more medical reason that they don't want you trying whole foods, versus something like, oh, well, I don't know much about it, I'm not sure how to support you, those kinds of things. Because then you can kind of work on how they could support you, instead of how they, how
Sure.
the lack of knowledge. And finding dietitians that would help you, support kind of like that aspect, and maybe asking
Mm-hmm.
them then how they could support you. Or you know you talking about, I've looked into what your concerns might be. Like if they say, I've heard that it's gonna like block your tube. Well, yes, I've heard that too. And I know that, I need to do X, Y, Z. Maybe we can like talk more about what that looks like. But, I'm going to do X, Y, Z to make sure that I'm not putting myself at risk that way, to let them know that you've kind of like done your homework, that you're going to get support
Mm-hmm.
to kind of like the logistics. And maybe they can support you like, well, can we have like regular check-ins? Maybe you can, I can check in and you can see how like physically I'm doing, or you can help me by checking my lab work and making sure that that's like on track the way you want it to be, that they can kind
Sure.
of support you the way they know how.
Yeah. Now you mentioned like resources. So if somebody just maybe they come across maybe your page on Instagram, or they read something somewhere and they're like, "Oh, interesting. I didn't know that that was a possibility." Besides, obviously, you as a resource, where might you suggest that they look to start? So if they get from the doctor, like, well, I've heard that real food can clog your tube, and they want to do research, but they want to make sure that they're doing research in um, you know, in a place that has real research, real answers. They want to get the right information. Do you have a place where they could start or should start or what to look for when trying to get those resources?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if everybody's heard of the Oli Foundation, but the Oli Foundation in the
Mhm,
States is really good resource I mean, in Canada too, right? They have lots of resources online
mhm,
in terms of, good places to start for blended tube feeding, just support in general. I think, you want to be looking for where the advice is coming from. So, and that's, not to say that there's not like, moms out there that have been doing this for a long time that couldn't, support as well. But when you get into kind of like specific medical needs or specific conditions, you really want to have the support then of your GI or, seeking out a
mhm,
dietitian. If they have a dietitian maybe associated with your clinic that they can refer you to, that the dietitian there can maybe support you through that kind of more logistically. I'm not the only one out here kind of doing blended tube feeding.
mhm.
That there are dietitians out there that support it, and even if you were to ask your dietitian, you might be surprised. I think how they could sup- could support you. I mean,
Sure.
I do have my website, my social media. There are courses out there too, and I have my own course to kind of help people through that. Um, but I think looking for proper, not I won't say proper, but um trained people that are going to support
Professionals.
if you professionals if you have
Yeah.
specific medical needs, right? Like a lot of people on tube feeds have complex medical needs. So you know
Mhm,
it's not to say that you have to be, like you said, you've become more mindful of like all your macros and micros, right? That like there
mhm.
are times when that is really important. um and, there are times when it's maybe less important, but maybe establishing some sort of plan up front in terms of how you're going to move forward on blended tube feeding and making sure that you're doing it safely and that you're getting what you need. Because
Mhm.
then, you want in order to succeed, right? Like you don't want to say, I'm going to try this and then it not go well and it's discouraging, right? That,
Yeah.
you know, you want to show your team that, that it's going to be successful. Yeah.
So, talking about, like, safety and doing it, I don't necessarily wanna say the right way because the right way looks a little bit different for everybody, but, like, the pre-blended comes in cartons, there's I don't wanna say minimal safety around it or minimal thoughts, but, basically you crack it open, you put in how much they need, you shake it, you put it in, keep it at a stable, temperature, etcetera. There's not really much to think about when it comes to the preparation, storage, and safety. That completely changes when you're blending real foods and you have to store them and pack them and things like that. Is there, um, or what should a patient consider, like with food safety and things like that, when they're starting their own foods? Or maybe there's some foods that blend better than others. So there's like something small to start with, or, and then kind of gradually making your way up. But I can imagine there's a little bit more to consider when you are prepping food, just like there is when you're prepping food for a meal. You don't share your raw chicken cutting board with your fresh vegetable cutting board, right?
Exactly,
So,
exactly, yeah.
those types of those types of consideration I imagine are very similar here, but is there anything additional that people really should be mindful of or definitely keep in the back of their head like, "Oh, I need to pay attention to this."
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a big, kind of like a misconception around, blended tube feeding, and that there's like this big, concern for, foodborne illness and kind of like, well, you can't blend food and put it through a feeding tube, like you're gonna get sick. But really,
Mhm.
like you mentioned, obviously, there's like the basics of food preparation, and really that kind of like disconnect between like how you prepare food for eating versus how you prepare food for blended tube feeding. And of course, you follow the same, food safety in terms of, yes, keeping your raw chicken separate from your vegetables that you're going to blend, right? So, but then beyond that, kind of the blending and blocking of the tube is another big concern. So really, like the safety in terms of blending adequately and choosing those foods. So it depends kind of on your setup in terms of what blender that you have. A lot of people don't want to invest necessarily right off the bat in a high powered blender if you're not really
Sure.
sure about how this is going to go for you. So if you kind of just
Mhm.
have like your regular household blender, so I would always suggest starting with the softer ingredients and not going right to like nuts or seeds or, stringy like tough meats or those kinds of things. But, you can start with lots
Okay.
of different soft foods, or even some people even just start with like pre like blended foods. So like, like baby food pouches or jars of food that are already smooth, and you can kind of integrate that into even, your formula, or just using single ingredients to start. But so blending time is really important. And then, just making sure that you don't have any lumps or, big chunks of things. So starting with the softer foods is important.
Mhm.
But blending really for like several minutes to make sure that everything is that nice and smooth. Some people choose to use like a fine mesh strainer to make sure um,
That's a good
when
idea.
you're getting started, just to make sure that you don't have any big, lumps or anything. But then to be mindful,
Mhm.
then sometimes like that can get rid of some of the like the fibers and nutrients too. And so, when you're becoming more, often when people are kind of just starting out and becoming more comfortable with the idea of this, that they use a sieve. But then once you kind of establish that this is like going to work for you, investing in a high power blender is a good idea, just because you're going to be blending kind of like consistently.
Mhm.
Usually, I mean, that's not to say that you have to do it every day all the time, right?
Mhm.
Um, but that like if you're going to kind of proceed with doing a good portion, really investing in a high power blender is going to, really allow you to kind of blend anything anything you want, right? That'll like take care of all those nuts and seeds, and you can really have um, a great variety in your diet. Um, and now I'm like honestly going back to your original question with like food safety. Um,
Yeah.
so like yeah, like particle size, like blending, making sure it's smooth, the food safety in terms of like preparing. Really then it comes down to two, like you can't the thing with standard formulas is they have like a longer hang time, right? So you can like
Mhm.
crack the toucher or the can open, and you can hang that overnight, right? It's safe. It's not going to grow bacteria the same way food would. So just the
Mm.
same way as you would think of like you're not going to eat a egg salad that's been out on the counter all night.
Mm.
You can't kind of like blend up a food and then hang that same like the food for like 12 hours, right? That we want to stay out of that kind of danger zone where you wouldn't eat the food that's sitting on the counter. So saying you wouldn't hang it overnight. So the general rule is just like a 2-hour hang time. So sometimes it becomes
Okay.
more of a like logistics in terms of like if you have a J tube and you're feeding more like or feeding more continuously with a pump, and being more mindful of like food hang times and limits that way. It's kind of more of the concern that way, and not to say that you can't do it, but and then you get into like tube size and safety that way. So generally you want like a 14 French feeding tube.
Okay.
That's kind of like the general recommendation out there. And again, it's kind of like a caveat is that like, people with smaller tubes doesn't mean that you can't do it. You might just have like a harder time getting all your nutrition that way. And so, and there's ways around, or ways not, don't want to say around it, but like there's ways to still, you know, do meet some of those desires in terms of getting blended food in, and maybe you use a portion of your formula at nighttime when it's like you need to top up with nutrition on the pump and you need that formula. Like a lot of people do a combination of blended food and kind of like the standard formulas. And I even mentioned earlier some of those like pre-blended formulas have a longer hang time than say like your own homemade blend, but like not as long as
Yeah.
like a synthetic formula. So there's like lots of combinations, right? Like it's not like a one size fits
Mhm.
all, and it's just the idea around it is it just kind of building more like freedom and autonomy, um, to be able to be able to kind of shift what you're doing on a given day, like because um, tube feeding is kind of like always viewed as this more like medical thing, right? And I
Mhm.
think the nice thing about um, blended food, and once you become more comfortable with all these kind of like safety things, you get that confidence and really kind of that feeling that it's not really like a medical procedure anymore, a medical treatment anymore. It's like part of your everyday life, and it's really just like
Yeah.
it's eating through a medical device, but we're really just
Mhm.
delivering it that way, right? That it's like so you follow all these same things and you're aware of all the, precautions and things, but in the end, really, it's just like nourishing your body through a medical device. Is that,
Yeah.
yeah,
No, I it's so interesting looking at it that way because everything, like, I remember when I went home on a feeding tube, like, thank goodness for my social media friends at that point because I went home with a tube and it was just kinda like, "Here you go." I'm like, "What do I do with this?
yeah,
How do I clean this? How fast do I push? Like, what happens if this?" And, like, there was such little conversation around, like, what to do when you get home, and I had some really, really great friends, and I was very, very lucky to they, worked me through a lot of things down to what's the most comfortable backpack, to have
yeah,
when you go out because 'cause they've trialed so many, right?
yeah,
And, you know, it was such a scary thing, and it was such, like, a medicinal thing at the time where you're nervous about it, you don't know what to do, everything is spread out. You need to go down a checklist of like, did I do this? Then did I do this? And it feels so unnatural in the beginning, especially when you have very limited access to education, even in what you're doing around that. So then you kind of have to figure that out on your own, and everything just feels kind of funky. And then eventually it just becomes part of your routine and just, hearing how you talked about that, like our meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, like they don't feel weird, right? Like that's just what you do. You get up, you eat well, at least I hope most of us eat breakfast. Whatever your breakfast looks like, but
yeah.
like, you get up, you eat, you get up, you do what you want to do. And it's like it becomes part of your routine. And this interrupts that. So I can feel just from how you're talking about it too that there's got to be this like switch that happens where all of a sudden it's just kind of like you settle into this routine, but it stops feeling so weird and so like medicinal or mechanical, however you want to look at that, where you're like, you know what? I feel like a bagel with cream cheese for breakfast. So, you know what? You get a bagel with cream cheese for breakfast. A lot of people can't actually say that. You're maybe begrudgingly pouring your formula in the bag and, like, man, I really miss a bagel with cream cheese. But it's like, it's this cool thing I feel like that can happen in your head where it's that piece of the switch. It's that mental game where you feel included, maybe not just at the table with like your family around holidays, because we all know that every freaking holiday has to do with food, and it's so frustrating when you can't eat the dang food. And if maybe you have less supportive people in your life or just people who are unsure how to support you, it can be that much more uncomfortable. So it's like, I just hear this beautiful thing that can happen for some people where it's this really big mental shift that food isn't as big of an obstacle anymore. And maybe you don't hate it as much because you got to eat that bagel with cream cheese. Can you tell I want a bagel with cream cheese?
There's always something that somebody wants. Yeah.
Like now you get that. I remember one time my cousin was very little at this point. Like, I don't know, maybe I say very little, but in my head I'm like, anyone younger than me feels very little. But in like the beginning when I couldn't eat and all I wanted was pizza. Like to the point where if I sniffed pizza or if I heard you had pizza 3 weeks ago, like, I just hated you because all I wanted was pizza. And he had a birthday party and, I walk in with my mom and he comes out and he's like, "No, no, 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 you can't come in here." Trying to be very sweet because everybody knew, like, I didn't wanna be around it. And in his head, he was trying to protect me from that and keep me from seeing something that hurt me. But all that did was remind me how far away from all of these things I was, and that if I couldn't be included in the food, I just couldn't be included. So it's like you're always on the outside looking in, and I just think of I know this is a very, very long tangent. We talked about that in the beginning. I go on these too.
No, I do.
But,
Yeah.
you know, having that to be like, "I can have pizza. I will take that slice. It looks really good." And it's such a crazy thing to be able to do because there's also the stigma around tube feeds that, like, if you get on tube feeds or if you're on TPM, like, your life is over. Like,
Right.
everything is over. Everything
Right.
is done for. Like, this is the end of it. Like, you're never gonna be able to do anything again. This is just like, absolutely not. I think about those like TPN tube feeds because I've been fortunate and unfortunate enough to need both of those at one point in my chronic illness journey that they gave me, like, I don't think I would be here functioning if I hadn't have gotten stronger while on those things. And this whole mentality around real food blending and inclusion and finding a new relationship with food and balancing that relationship with food and really learning about nutrition because that's such a huge hole for so many people, not just anybody who has gastroparesis or chronic illness, but like just all of us in general, I think really struggle with nutritional education. Like, learning about your macros and what your balance is and maybe what your calories should be and how to do that with different foods and everything and really be included in that process. Like, I just love that idea. So I've been talking about it for long enough. I've just loved that idea so much. And I
Yeah.
hope that, the people who listen to this who are on tube feeds or, might need tube feeds or are trying to decide, like, do I want to take this route because I'm running out of options, to know that there are actually options within your options. Maybe not right away,
Right.
but down the road, there's so much more conversation that we can have around this. And I just love that there's more of that happening now and that we get to be a part of getting that information out, to the community.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a very long
No, I was like, I wrote a couple of things down because I was like, oh, I want to come back to that because yeah, like you're like talking about stigma around like even
Mhm.
having a feeding tube in the first place, right? It's like this medical thing, this medical process that happens in the hospital. And it's like when you ask
Mhm.
somebody, like, what do you think like a person on tube feeds looks like? So it's like a lot of people think of it's like the sick person in the hospital. It's like you said, like
Yeah.
people think like, oh, it's the end, right? But it's like, oh, for a lot of people, like once you kind of get over that or not get over it, get past kind of like that idea or that stigma that like it can bring so much benefit also, right? That like you're
Yeah.
really struggling with whatever, finding foods that you can eat or you have dysphagia and you can't swallow and you're just struggling with, getting these modified textures and it's just not right. It's just like, but then getting a feeding tube can really like take that pressure away from, having that stress around food, I think too, right? So to give you
Yeah.
like a different avenue to be able to like meet your nutrition. Um and so yeah, like the stigma that it's like the end or whatever, but that it actually can just give you like this new renewed kind of like
Mhm.
renewed energy and just nutrition and kind of getting
Yeah.
getting your body like stronger so you can feel better in general, right? And just kind of then having those opportunities around family gatherings too. Now I'm going on the tangent the other way because I just wanted to touch on some of those things that you said, right? Like, and there's
Yeah,
so many of like
go ahead.
our social gatherings are like focused on food, right? It's like a birthday party and we're gonna have pizza and ice cream and
Food.
cake, or you're going for
Mhm.
Thanksgiving dinner and it's focused on food. It's like, oh well, we're gonna go out and like, just even as simple as like meeting your friends, right? It's like we're gonna go out for dinner, and the focus being so much around food. And I don't want to say that, it's not like, I'm not naive to think that like blended tube feeding will like replace that
Fix
or
it.
fix
Yeah.
that, right? But just giving you another like way to feel that, you could have showed up at that party and, like you said, had the pizza in a different form, but still participated then
Mhm.
in that like that meal with people, I think is like a big reason, one of the big reasons why it's so nice, or that, you mentioned earlier, for people that like enjoy cooking and still, wanting to, that's like their way of providing for their family, or, feeling that
Yeah.
inclusion. And like, I still went to the farmer's market and I chose that food. I know where it came from. Having that sense of like
Mhm.
ownership around what you're putting in your body is like, is so nice for people too, right? So there's like so many like
Yeah.
cultural, traditional, inclusion, autonomy, all those things that like are outside of like the nutrients and like the benefits,
Yeah.
that way. Or even like, we didn't get into all like the kind of like GI stuff or whatever and nutrients in that way, but just kind of like even that like
Mhm.
more wholesome approach, or reasons why people might like to have that blended tube feeding option.
Yeah, I love that there's just so many pieces to this. And even thinking about tube feeds, where for me, when I had gotten my tube feed place in the like toward the beginning of the year, not this year, it was, oh gosh, almost a decade. Wow, it was almost a decade ago. Holy moly.
Yeah.
Um wow, okay. I feel like I'm aging myself here.
Oh,
But
time is weird. When I said
look,
I've been a dietitian for 20 years, what? Yeah.
you're like, "What?" Yeah.
Yeah.
But I had, that placed, and then it's like I was so sick at the time, and I felt so weak, and I wasn't getting the nutrients, and I was on TPN as well, but we were trying to wean me off of it because I had been septic a couple times, and we were trying to find a way to get me off of TPN, and eventually we were able to do that. And it was like 10 months later that I was able to run my first like road race of a 5K. And like that would not have been possible if I had have been relying on oral foods only, because, I could eat a little bit. My stomach could tolerate something, but it was not nearly enough for my output. There's a difference between training for a 5K versus a full marathon, but my output was still way more. My burn was way more than what I was taking in. So I was not able to get the strength to continue doing something. And because of tube feeds and the nutrition and everything that I was getting, I remember finishing that race, texting my GI with a picture at the finish line. I was like, I did it. We did it. We got here. And like, it was such a proud moment for me. And tube feeds fueled me through my first half marathon too. So like that whole piece of the strength, the other parts of just or the other parts outside of just the nutrition are just as important as the nutrition. However, that's important to you. Maybe you just want to do the easy thing, and that's great. If that works for you, that's awesome. But maybe there are other things that are important to you too. Like maybe the lack of ability to eat or being stuck on X, Y, or Z makes you feel even more isolated. This could pull you out of that if that's something that you're looking for. And I, I really just, the whole idea here is so great. And I'm like, when you're talking about the farmer's market, I'm like, yes, like that's so, like, to think that you picked out these strawberries, you picked out something like you're eating strawberries. You haven't had strawberries in 10 years. And guess what? You get to have strawberries today. Like, that's such a mind blowing concept for me, thinking about where I was when I was on tube feeds and how different that could have looked around it, even though it was only It only held me back when it didn't work right. But
Yeah.
for when it worked great, I loved it. But when when it came discombobulated and I threw it up, it was not great. But, that was just a me problem. But, you know, it's just such a great option for so many people who are in this space and maybe feeling stuck and they don't know why. Maybe they'll be like, this is this could maybe help me get unstuck. This might help me heal a little bit. Maybe this is what I want to look for. And hopefully, through listening to you, your experience, what you have been able to share with us with all of these different parts of what goes into a relationship with food, maybe it'll give somebody the confidence to say, I want to give this a try. And hopefully, if they do, they will love it and find a way to include it in their life. And that's just awesome.
Oh, I would love it if this kind of like opened the idea, or just like to start thinking about how tube feeding could look different, right? Or even just how it could make you feel. I mean, and I know probably a lot of your listeners are obviously dealing with gastroparesis and issues that way too, right? But that it can help with a lot of, GI issues as well, in terms of like
Hmm.
nausea and reflux. And that
Yeah.
this could be just another thing. I know it's a lot of more trial and error, but something to kind of give a shot.
Yeah. And as much as we love and hate trial and error over
Right,
here,
right.
if it's something that you're really interested in, to know that there are people like you out there and there are resources to tap into to make that trial and error process hopefully maybe a little bit shorter or just a little bit more successful, that that could be the boost that the person needs to really make the jump and say, this is what I want to try, because there are resources. It's not just some random thing that I'm like, I'm just going to blend, food A, B, and C together and hope for the best. Like, you don't actually have to do that. There are those resources. And talking to your doctors about trying something new can be really scary. Maybe you don't have a great relationship with your doctor, or maybe you've been, gaslit in the past when you're asking for things, or maybe you're just not sure how to approach, the doctor. I think the way you described it earlier was really great, just to kind of, it's almost like having your scenario A, B, and C, right? It's
Right,
like if
right,
they say, well, I don't know how to support you in that. You're like, well, I did find some of these resources. Can we do this together?
right.
Or can you refer me to somebody, to really have all of all of your arguments like ready to go in there. It's more work for us, but everything's always burdensome on the patient. But I think the way that you suggested doing it can be really successful for somebody if they really want to try and just kind of shoot your shot and see how it goes, right?
Yeah, I mean, if it's something that's important to you, right? Or, you've tried, like, you can go to, like, we've tried this. Like, this is something I
Mhm.
really, it's important to me to maybe to try this next. Like, how can you support me, right? It's intimidating to bring up, and having, you go into your situations kind of having different responses. But if you kind of like go in there with and prepared with like how you might handle, then
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, no, that's been great. Well, thank you so much for all of this. I've learned so much. I'm like,
Oh,
Why
good.
didn't I find you when I was on tube feeds?" But I'm so glad that we have you now as a resource and all this information for all of our tube fed friends, or maybe tube fed friends out in our community. So thank you so much for everything today. It's been really great chatting.
Thank you so much for having me. I'd love, if anybody has any follow-up questions, I'm always open to people reaching out. I want to hear, how people are doing, and if you have questions kind of generally, or you're getting pushback, or even finding, some different finding those resources too, and
Mhm.
pointing in the right direction. I'd love to kind of hear from the tube feeding community as well. So
Yeah,
can
I
reach
will
out.
make sure that we put all of your contact information in the caption so they don't have to go searching too far for it.
Perfect.
And yeah, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.